Hey gang, I'm back here with another comic book interview. Josh Williamson has been through the trenches and done all kinds of different work for a multitude of publishers across the North American comic book industry. The chat we had was really illuminating and amazing. He was really frank and down to earth about the highs and lows he's had and things he's learned over the years. I think you're going to get a lot out of it.
A note of it.
Josh Williamson, welcome. It is great to have you here. We have been doing this stuff for a while. We've been doing the comic thing for a while now.
Yeah, I feel like I've known you for a really long time at this point. Like, I feel like we've been doing this for a bit. Like, yeah,
right?
It's really fun. Yeah,
it's
yeah,
fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating to see. I think the one thing I'm really missing is the convention circuit where we all kind of see each other, just even if it's just briefly, that feeling of, yep, still here, still doing it after all these years, you know?
I just backed out of a convention. I was going to go to MegaCon, and
Oh,
I
were
was
you?
really, I was really excited about it. And part of it was I just wanted to see like my friends again,
Yes.
like
Yeah,
see my comic book people I used to see all the.
Zoom calls are not the same. No offense to anybody. It's fine and whatever,
No,
but
no.
it's not the same as spending some time and commiserating and celebrating and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, for sure. Like Scott, Scott James and I, we used to get together at conventions and we would plan all this DC stuff and we would talk about Creator Own. We would talk about, craft and ideas and thoughts about our futures and our careers and stuff. And then we would also map out our big plans for DC. And we used to do that all the time. Like we would go and do it at New York Comic Con. We would always go a couple days early and just hang out at Scott's house. And one of the things we were been talking about this a little bit lately, where like there's a lot of times where the three of us start talking. We're like, man, we would just sit at a restaurant and talk about this stuff. It'd be so much easier, and like we would get so much more done quicker because we used to do that. But we'll get back to that eventually.
Yeah. I think it sounds weird because I know sometimes when you're doing a bunch of conventions, it can really kind of wear on you. By the end of the season, you're like, oh, thank God I can just stay home. But now definitely like, the fondness, like I got to get back to it. I really want to see
for sure. I miss it. I do miss it.
I will not take the travel for granted. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Right. So tell me about this career of yours in comics. First of all, before we even get into the professional work, I assume you grew up a comic reader, like so many of us. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've never lived in a house that didn't have a short box, basically.
Nice.
My mom and dad both read comics when they were kids. And so they were already comic book readers. And then when I was born, they weren't still reading comics, but they had their old comics in the house, right? Like we had books. Like actually one of the first comics I ever read is this one right here. It's the Great Comic Book Heroes. Like Mark Waid talks about this book too.
Oh, wow.
Bill Pfeiffer. This is their version. This was theirs.
Amazing.
It's from the 50s, and I think it's from the 50s. I'm
so it's sort of like an encyclopedia of comic stuff.
Dude, this is really weird because basically it is a collection of origin stories from all the big names. So what's interesting about this book is it has Superman, Captain Marvel when it was still Fawcett, Batman, Human Torch, Flash, Green Lantern, which is Alan Scott, the Spectre, Hawkman, Wonder Woman, Submariner, Captain America, Plastic Man, and the Spirit.
Whoa! And they've got all in one book, and they got the rights to reproduce them all. Like
it's the first issues or the first appearances of all of those characters.
Wild.
Plus like little write-ups and stuff. But this thing it has a bunch of stuff about the history of comics at the time. And it's fascinating because like this is something you would never see now, right? Like you would never see a book that is just straight out like here's Marvel and DC put together in one book.
Right.
So I got this when I was a kid, and then I started reading Jack Kirby's Superpowers, which was tied in the toy line. And I started reading that when I was like maybe 3 or 4. And then by the time I was like, elementary school aged, I was reading books, but I would go to a couple different comic stores. But the big thing was like going to Costco, which is like, I'm not sure you have Costco there, but
we do.
Okay, so Costco or Target or whatever, I would go and buy packs of comics anywhere I could find comics.
Those like 3-packs and stuff?
Yeah, 3-pack. Oh, well, so the Costco ones, what they would do was, especially in the late 80s, late 90s, what they would do is they would sell them in these gigantic like bricks of comics.
Oh, really?
I mean, like this. It basically be like whatever they published that month.
Wow.
And it would be cheap. So my parents would buy me those. So about once a month, I basically would get like this huge brick. And they weren't in order. So like I would get stuff. Stuff always out of order. And then the story I always tell is this one, is that by the time I was like 11, I was already reading stuff regularly. Like I loved, I was really hooked into Batman, and I was like obsessed with Batman, and I would always buy like single issues of Batman. I had a couple of Batman collections. There's this great one that John Byrne did back then. It was like Untold Tales of Batman, and they made this like little digest size little graphic novel. It's black and white.
Nice.
It was like his pre-crisis story, which was
cool.
so super different. But so I was always getting stuff like that. And then what happened was I had subscriptions. So this is like my parents, you read back of comics, they would have that whole subscription page, right?
Yeah.
And so I used to do that. I would get like I had 4 subscriptions to Marvel, and I had 4 subscriptions to DC, and then Batman Returns came out, and I went to the movie theater, and in front of the movie theater, this big sign, and it was like brand new comic book store opening next door to the movie theater. If you bring in your ticket stub, you get a free $1 comic. Which back then dollar comics were just back issues for the most part, because comics were $1. So it's not like it's like $1, $1.25.
Sure,
like I remember when comics went to $2.25, and I was like, oh my God. Like so getting $1 comic, that wasn't like you're getting that was a book. You could get like something good, and I so the movie's over. I go to the comic book store, I get my parents ticket stubs, I give them the ticket stubs, I get 3 comics, 3 Batman book.
Do you remember which ones they were?
Covers. Do I know what they are?
Oh, the Breyfogle ones?
Yeah, they're Norm Breyfogle comics.
Nice.
And I know what they were. So I grab them, and that summer I saw Batman Returns in the theater 17 times. Because what I would do is I would go watch the movie, and I was addicted to it. I loved it. And I loved Batman 89, but Returns, for whatever reason, just like I got hooked onto it.
Right.
But what I would do is I would wait for the lights to come on, and I would walk down the aisles, and I would find ticket stubs that people dropped.
Oh my gosh.
And I would collect them, and I'd go in there, and I would just put them on the counter, and they would be like, whatever, go, And
nice.
So I went, and
they knew they had an addict at that point.
Yeah. Oh man, I was definitely an addict at that point. And so
that's amazing.
That was
how old are you at this point?
I'm 11.
Amazing.
I'm 11. So, but at this point, I was like on my own. So I'm like, I was riding my bike to the comic book store like every day that summer, and I would go to the movies. There was a Pizza Hut there, so my routine was I would go watch a movie,
right?
Go to Pizza Hut, get a personal pan pizza, play NBA Jam, right? And then I would go to the comic store.
This little slice of summer, nice.
Yeah. I would bug the shit out of them, and that's when Wizard was starting to come out, and I was like, I remember being like, I don't know anything about comics, and they'd be like, all right, here's Wizard magazine. It was like in the early issues, so that was my first glimpse into like other stuff, and I was, so that was when I started riding my bike all the time. I started going to the lived in California, and so there was this thing. It was called the Shrine Convention. It was always like the last Sunday of the month, and it basically was a giant swap meet, but they would do. It was this huge swap meet, man. It was like my first early conventions, but they would show movies or they would show cartoons in the back. So like one time I went and they did a marathon of the X-Men animated series, but the last 2 episodes were the premiere of like the new episodes. So I went to that for a day. That was a lot of fun. I go to that every month, and I would just buy comics and stuff. And I remember the first time I went to it, because at that point I was hooked. I was going like, I'm a comic person now, right?
Right.
And I remember me and my friends, was the first time we were going to the Shrine Convention, and we had read in Wizard that if you want to break into comics or you want to make comics, you got to go to a convention. And so me and my friends, we found out about this convention, the Shrine Convention. So we spent all my friends spent the night at my house on like a Saturday night, and we stayed up all night long drawing pictures and drawing superheroes, drawing like comic book names, all this stuff. We had this whole pitch package, and our whole plan was like, we're gonna go to this convention tomorrow. We're gonna find somebody. We're all fourth. This happened when I was in I was in 5th grade when that happened. In my 4th grade yearbook, this is really funny. My 4th grade yearbook, under my name, it says like future career. It actually says comic book editor. It doesn't even say comic book writer, it's comic book editor. So we went to the convention. It was 5th grade. Go the next day. There are no editors at this con. Like it's not. It's more of a swap meet,
Yeah.
It was they had comics and trades, and we go, and I remember being like, how much is it for the first appearance of Gambit? Oh man, it's $20. That's so much money, and being like, I gotta get that money, and I remember the Clone Saga. I was also really into like the collecting part of it, like a speculator part of it too, So I go to cons, I buy like limited books. I was, always grabbing stuff, and the Clone Saga was about to start, hadn't started yet. And I remember it was like $100 for the first appearance of the Spider Clone, right? It was like Spider-Man and I think
one,
like that.
yeah,
But you know what I mean? It's like
149. Yep.
I can't remember the numbers, but basically it was like, oh, it's the first appearance of Spider Clone, and I remember being like,
the Jackal and all that stuff.
Yeah. Oh man, I gotta buy the $100. That's an investment, because this Spider Clone thing is gonna blow up. Because if you're reading Wizard at the time, it felt like a really big deal. Yeah. So I remember buying that and just like going to that stuff, and then eventually when I was 14. One of the managers, they had opened up a new location that was even closer to where I was, and my mom would go to the mall like every Saturday, and she basically would just like, go do whatever you want. So I'm like, I'm gonna go in this comic book store and just bug the shit out of them. I remember even at the comic book store before it was the one closer to me, I would go there so often that the owner sometimes was like, listen, I'll give you some free comics if you like sort these cards. Like, I remember one of the first things he asked me to sort was Wildstorm. He was like, open these Wildstorm packs, see if there is a set here, sort the set, I will give you a comic. Great. So one day the manager of the comic store was closer to me, that was in the mall. It was like it was a chain. There were 3 stores, and they basically were like, do you want to just work here? Like, help.
It's just easier.
Yeah, do bags and boards. Help me organize this stuff, help me price books, help me put stuff away. And so I was like, all right, yeah, hell yeah, I'll do that. He was like, you can come here every Saturday and do this. I'm like, all right, cool. So I was 14, started doing that.
Nice.
And then it changed from Saturdays to Saturday plus Wednesday night, because they needed help on Wednesdays.
Right.
And then I would go to other cons with them to like help them run those cons or whatever, and do stuff. And that went on for a while. And then I went to, and this whole time I was like trying to write comics and trying to figure stuff out.
That transition happens where you go from being obsessed with like characters and teams to like specific creators, where there's certain creators that you were seeking out. Was that like through Wizard telling you they were hot stuff, or is it because you were into their stuff specifically?
Gravitate towards certain things, like whatever was like really attractive to me, I guess, at the time, right? Like whatever.
Which one stood out?
Well, at the time, it was a lot of Peter David stuff. Like it was, he was doing, at the time I'm talking about, he was doing Aquaman, he was doing Hulk, Spider-Man 2099, and X Factor. And I loved all 4 books. And I think that was the first time I was like, I love all 4 of these comics, and they're by the same person.
Right. What do they have in common? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I started reading more Peter David stuff, and that led me to just other paths. And then I was just like all over the place. I mean, that's all pre-working at the comic store too. Like by the time I got to the comic store, I feel like I was a quote unquote, like, how would I put this? I considered myself an expert in comics by that point. Like, I feel like I knew everything,
right.
Just because I could name every character on a poster, I felt like I knew everything, right? And but yeah, I started looking at like Peter David, and then I started mostly looking at superheroes. I wasn't that into, I remember with Image, I was upset when the people left Marvel, when the partners left Marvel to go to Image. As a kid, I was like, oh my God, what are they doing? And I didn't buy any Image books for, I would say, the first year, or maybe the first 8 months, actually. Yeah, I would say the first 8 months, I wasn't really regularly buying it. And one day I went to the comic store. It was before I was working there. And my brother bought an issue of Youngblood. And I was in the car with him, and I started flipping through it, and I was like, maybe there's something to this. Maybe I should read these books. And I went and I started buying Image books. And I think with Wizard plus starting to buy, I started to branch out. Then I was like, oh, what's this independent thing? What's this? By the time I started working at the comic book store, that's when it like took off, because
because you've got access to everything.
And that was when I started getting really hooked into Vertigo. Like, I remember right before I worked at the comic book store, one of the books I started really getting into was Grant Morrison. I was reading Invisibles, and I was reading How to Kill Your Boyfriend. And
those,
I remember,
those issues were so mind blowing at that right
oh
age.
yeah,
Like they just hit you like a bomb. Yeah.
yeah. And I started, and the comic books I worked at, they were very much a superhero store. They
Yeah.
did not have a lot of, I remember the first issue of Invisible was like behind the counter because it had the F word in it, right? And it was
Right.
like, oh, it's over here. And I remember picking up an issue of Preacher just randomly and being like, oh my God, like, what is this? And
Yeah.
I think I was already reading Hitman. So I was reading Hitman first.
Okay.
And then I was like, I loved Hitman. I remember reading the first Hitman. Well, actually, I didn't read Hitman first. I read Bloodlines first. And then one of the Bloodlines annuals was the Hitman one.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is amazing. What is this? And then I started getting really, really into Garth Ennis. And then I was like, what else does this guy do? And that's when someone was like, read Preacher. And I read like one random issue of Preacher. And I was just like, oh my God. And I went to a convention and I, at the time, the comic book store I worked at, they didn't really do trades. It was all single issues. They were very much like, these books came out this week.
Yeah, yeah.
They mostly dealt with Image and superheroes, but it was really superhero.
But Vertigo was so instrumental in that trade format becoming, such a sales hook for people, right? Because it was all about the storytelling and the library of each series, and they were cohesive, from beginning to end. You were generally the same creative team through most of it, or so
I started going to shows and buying Preacher and buying Sandman, and really started getting deeper and deeper into grabbing whatever I could, and then got really into I remember reading Crisis on Infinite Earths when I was a senior in high school, and just being like, because you'd hear about these books, right? And then reading that, started reading. I remember reading Watchmen once in high school and being like, I do not understand this. Like as a high school kid, I was like, I guess there's superheroes in this. I didn't understand it. By the time I got to college, so I actually, I feel like I got tricked. So when I was in high school, all I wanted to do was make comic books.
Right.
As a side note to the comic book store I worked at in high school, Eric Stevenson used to go to that comic book store and would buy his books there.
Nice.
That's how I actually met him originally, was from that. I used to annoy the shit out of him. Anyway, so I would always ask him all these questions I would always ask him questions about stuff. So I when I was in high school, I really wanted to work in comics. This is all I knew, and I would hear about internships and I would hear about this, and I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a designer. I just wanted to work in comics. Like all I cared about was, how do I get a job in comics? I actually went to San Diego Comic-Con and I went to the CrossGen booth when all they had, like, books weren't even out yet. They just had this like giant booth.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they had this huge orange booth at San Diego Comic-Con, like 1999. They had this like humongous thing. It was kind of, if I remember correctly, it was kind of, where the Sideshow booth is in San Diego?
Yeah.
It's almost like, if I remember correctly, it was almost like that area, but like that size of a booth.
Wow.
Like it was in that area.
Yeah.
It might have been where Neil Adams is usually at, like that area over there, but that size. So I even talked to Mark Alessi at that con and was like, I want to work in comics. And he was like, here's an application. He had their application for CrossGen was this huge packet. And I still have it. Yeah, I still have it because I never applied. But you had to move to Florida. So it was this huge thing. And so I was just like, whatever I could do, whoever I could talk to, creators, whatever I could get. And then when I went, what happened was I was in high school and they had like a college fair, right? Like because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And a lot of my friends were either going to certain kinds of colleges or they're going to like community college in town and all this stuff. And I was like, I had options, I had things I could do, but I was just like, all I want to do is work in comics. And I saw this giant banner and it was a Jeff Matsuda drawing of Wolverine. It was this huge banner and it was like comics, design, all this stuff. It was like everything I wanted. And I went up and I'm like, what is this? And I was like, do you guys teach comic book stuff? And they were like, yes, we have people who worked in comics at our school. Fill this out and we'll contact you. So they called me one night and they were like, here's our system, here's our program. It's in
what's the school? Oh, okay.
It was called Brooks College.
Okay.
They are no longer accredited. They do not exist. So that's a whole other thing. Basically, I went to the school and I liked it. And I remember, so when I went to this college, there were teachers there that had worked for like heavy metal and had worked in comics, but it was mostly all about advertising and the actual production of books. There was a lot of graphic design stuff.
Right.
But the stuff I really gravitated toward was the actual production of books. Like I learned a lot there. But my very first day of college, the night before, I had gone out with a bunch of friends for someone's birthday, and it was also like the last time we knew we were going to be with each other. So of course I got way too drunk, and I ended up in sleeping in. And so I completely missed orientation. I missed everything. Like I got in my car, and I remember I had a convertible Mustang. And so I get in my car real quick. I got all my stuff with me, and I have the directions to my college with me. The moment I hit that freeway, those directions flew out the convertible. Flew out the convertible. So I'm like, okay, I've driven to the school once before. I have to now do it by memory. And I got there super late, and it was this whole thing. And they were like, well, your room, because you got here so late, there was a problem with your room. So for this weekend, you're going to be staying in somebody else's room. And those people weren't going to be there that weekend. They were a little upset about it because they were like, there's this person just staying in our room on a cot for the weekend. The room's not going to be ready until Monday. So I don't know anybody in college. I don't know what's going on. I'm in the dorms, some of the dorms, and I only thing I brought with me to read was the Watchmen trade. And I was like, I'm going to reread this thing. And I'm gonna dive back in. I'm trying to understand this. So, and I already been reading it for a while that summer, and so now I was actually maybe I was older, but I was understanding it more this time. I was much more. So I go and I remember I went to get food. I come back to the dorm room, and I'm sitting on this cot reading Watchmen, just being like, man, it's such a weird experience. Like your first night really alone, you know, for college and everything. And all of a sudden, the door opens up. The door of my dorm just slams open, and there are these two guys standing there. One of them has this gigantic mohawk and this gigantic leather jacket, and he throws my keys at me. And he's just like, you left your keys in the door, dipshit. Like, don't do that. And he was the RN doing his round, but he was just like, you left your keys in the door. But the guy with him stopped him, and he was like, oh man, look what he's reading. And he's like, you reading Watchmen, you like that? And I was like, yeah, you guys know. I was so excited. I was like, you guys know comic books?
Sure.
Like, you know comics? And they were like, come with us. And I got up, and I went with these two guys, and sure enough, what I found out was like every person that lived in the dorms was into comics, basically. Nice. Like everybody there was into comics. Everyone's rooms were just wall to wall. And I went to this one guy's room, and he had like every page of Joe Mad Battle Chasers printed out, and like a whole wall, you know. And they took me into this one room, and everyone had done all their graphic design projects were all about comic books. Like everything they did, everything was comics. And I was just like, oh my God, I figured it out. And in that process, so meeting those people, and a lot of them, because we were in California, a lot of them actually knew people who worked in comics, right? Like they knew other people. And
2 degrees of separation to Wildstorm or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, and a lot of people like knew Rob Liefeld, knew Awesome Comics at the time. Awesome Comics, they were still doing stuff so like Kieran Grant and those guys, like they knew those guys. And like Marlo Akiza, who was an inker for Rob Liefeld, like all those people, like I was able to start meeting people, Top Cow people. I found out that school was a pipeline to be an intern for Wildstorm and Top Cow. But they stopped right before I got there because the 2 interns they had got before me basically sucked, and they were like, we are not doing interns anymore. So I was like, no. But so when I was in college, I just learned how to make books. It was interesting because when I was in school, everyone wanted to be artists. There was a lot of artists. And I met a couple people who wanted to write comics. And I was like, all right, cool. I like making books, and I'm a very organized person. And I feel like I'm a very like, where do I put this? I'm a herder. So I'm very like, here's how we're going to do this. Like, I'm going to get all you together. We're going to
project manager style.
Yeah, we're going to do this thing. And so, because I still have this attitude to this day. So I was like, we're going to make this stuff work. But the entire time I was in school, all of the writers that were trying to write, I literally saw 1 page of writing the whole time. They just wouldn't do it. They would talk about it.
Ideas instead of,
Yeah, exactly.
I knew so. Okay, that. Yeah, I had a group of friends like that when I was in college. They were
we all do.
Yeah, they were always, in their head, they were already a huge hit, and they would noodle over logos, and they would do 100 design sketches, but they would never do page 1. And because if it was page 1, you could critique it, right? But if it's always just a concept sketch, or if it's always just a logo or just an idea or just jamming, then you can't critique it. You can't pin them down and go, this doesn't work yet, And I think in their head, it was like, that was a safe way for them to be creative without commitment,
Yeah. Oh yeah. But in that process, I met a lot of artists. So
Mhm.
in the beginning of my career, I didn't know any other writers. I only knew artists. And I think
Interesting.
there was something about the language of the artists I knew, the artists I talked to. Um, I was more comfortable there. I found writers really intimidating. It's like, even when I met other writers, I would meet like Joe Casey, or I would meet Grant Morrison. I would get really nervous talking to them about writing, because once you start getting into those circles, even just like going to cons, and you figure out like, okay, wait a minute. And back then, San Diego Comic-Con, the Hyatt was not as known, and that bar didn't exist downstairs. Right. It was upstairs. So you go up there and it was much more of a quiet experience. You would talk to like Joe Quesada or Grant Morrison. It was easier, but I was still like anxious. I remember talking to Grant Morrison about video games, just having like an hour-long conversation about video games, but never once being like, I want to write comic books.
Right.
But I would go to conventions. I started self-publishing books in 2001, that summer, and I would go to San Diego. And so my goal was every year at San Diego Comic-Con, I would go with a comic book, either a mini book or a printed book, whatever I could do.
So what are those early books? What are they called?
Oh God, they're all awful. The first book I ever did was this thing called, oh my God, it was called Razor Burn.
Okay.
It was called Razor Burn. Oh no, that's not what. Sorry, it was called Rough Cuts. That's it. It's called Rough Cuts. Okay. I have the one copy left. I remember because
I want to see this so bad now.
Oh, dude, it's so awful.
You gotta send me a scan. I gotta see it.
So I'll find it. I'll send it to you. Right. So we did this book called Rough Cuts, and me and two other friends, we were gonna self-publish this book, and we were gonna do mini comics of it. Mm-hmm. And I spent a whole week no sleeping. These are good lessons. I was only 20. I was only 20, So I'm like, I'm sitting there and I'm like, I spent a whole weekend coloring. Like I colored it myself because I knew how to do all this stuff. I learned it all. So I'm like, I'm gonna color this comic. I'm gonna spend like a week not sleeping to color this whole book. Color the whole book. And we're like, okay, we're gonna get it printed. Well, we're only gonna make so many of them, right? So we go to Kinko's at like midnight. And it's midnight, the Tuesday night before the convention, before San Diego. We're going to drive to San Diego from LA. We walk in there, and the guy is like, well, color is going to cost you this amount. And all of us are like, can't afford that. And he's like, well, we do back in black and white. Like, it's insanely cheaper to make these mini comics. Mm-hmm. And I remember being like, you mean to tell me I spent like a whole week not sleeping coloring?
We're gonna do black and white anyway.
Now we're gonna black and white anyway. I was like, all right, lesson learned. I will never do color again. Like in terms of that. So we printed it, and I remember so we're up really late. We're at Kinko's. We're getting it printed. We had to like do all this. Then you're on a computer, paying a computer in Kinko's to get it ready to go. Mm-hmm. Then printing these books out, and there was another group of guys that were there. They were in another studio. Guys like also doing copies. They were doing copies to give. They were all artists. All of them were artists, and they were going to give copies away to people at San Diego.
Yeah.
We started talking to these guys, like a whole other group of artists, all bullshit with each other. And I still worked at a comic book store at this time. I got a new job at a different comic book store, and I was talking to one of them, and I was looking at his art, and I'm like, man, this stuff is amazing. Like, this is really good. And I was like, you look like a guy who just published. I was obsessed with Wildstorm at the time. Okay. So I was like, you look like this artist. Your style reminds me of an artist who worked on a book at Wildstorm called Jet. And I was like, you look like, I had to think about it. I'm like, you look like, this art looks like Dustin Nguyen's work. And he was like, oh man, I know Dustin, fuck that guy. And he goes on this whole rant. He's like, that guy ripped off my style. This is going on for like 20 minutes. And I'm like defending Dustin. I'm like, Jet looks good, all this stuff. And this guy's like going back and forth. And then finally he goes, oh, I'm just fucking with you. I am Dustin Nguyen. So he was Dustin the whole time. And so
oh my God.
Then I started talking to Dustin a lot, and I found Dustin and I kept the same work hours, which at the time was like, because I had a day job and I was going to school. So it's like, your work hours are like 11
madness,
2, 3 or whatever. And so I started talking to him a lot because he would be inking in the middle of the night. And I started chatting with him and talking to him a lot. And then he started, because he had just started working on Wildcats, the Wildcats 3.0. Mm-hmm. And so he started introducing me to people who worked at Wildstorm, and I started talking to them. That's how I met like John Layman when he was the editor. I remember John Layman would come into the comic book store I worked at too. And so with him, I was like, I really want to write comics. And he's like, all right, pitch me something, pitch me something. And those are my early experiences of trying to pitch stuff and completely crashing and burning, because
Right.
I remember sitting down with him and being like, I got ideas. And I would start pitching him. And he's just like, what the fuck are you talking about? And John, like John isn't,
No, he's unvarnished, to say the least.
One time I remember I sent him this thing. I really wanted to write Stormwatch. And so I sent him a pitch for Stormwatch. It was 30 pages long. And I remember all he did was he wrote me back and he said, fuck you, I'm not reading that. And so I started learning through this process of talking to people I meet at cons. They would introduce me to people, other writers, and I started just, but this is still really early. This is like 2001, 2002,
right.
2003. So I'm still self-publishing and just kind of getting out there with these books, and I was writing these things. My goal was every year to make a one shot.
Right.
And by the time you get around to like 2007, I feel like I knew. 2006, I feel like I knew a lot of people, but I was not ready in any way to work in comics. Like I feel like I knew the right people, but I didn't understand sort of, I don't think I had like the emotional or professional maturity yet. I wasn't there yet. Like, and I think books I were making, it was like I had to learn how to make books, but I didn't know how to make not just good books, but like, it's hard to explain. It's like I knew how to do
what kind of stuff were that? So what were these books you were releasing?
Well, they were all superheroes. They were all superheroes, or they were all really weird. They weren't really anything like I don't feel like they were I'm not sure they weren't good. I mean, I can say that they weren't good, but most of them were like lazy superhero things, right? Or they were lazy action things. I wasn't really saying anything. They weren't even like the books I liked. And I think that was the lesson that it took me a long time.
So did you think you were just making stuff out of like you saw other things that were popular and you were just sort of fusing to the sides of those, or what?
I don't know.
What was driving it? Like,
I don't know.
Because I'll see this all the time. People will try and this thing is trendy, so I'll make this thing. And I'm like, do you care about that thing? And they admit that they don't.
Yeah. This is where I started having some of the troubles I was having, where it's like, I mean, I feel like my process was really long and hard because it was like, I don't know, it made me learn I was a slow learner in a lot of ways, right? Because I wasn't picking things up. And I remember, so I started, doing different books. Like I got some books picked up with Shadowline with Jim Valentino. He did a couple of my books, and I was still figuring things out. And
which titles are we talking about?
I did a book with him called Johnny Monster. Well, first I did a kid's book called Dear Dracula.
Okay.
Which I think is probably that was probably the first time I made something where I'm like, this is fully realized, There's a story, there's an intent, there's a theme, the art's here, everything kind of works, right? And he published that as like a kid's book, graphic novel, was a hardcover. And then I did a book called Johnny Monster. And now this is where I start falling into imitating a lot, or doing things that I thought I needed to do, right? So at the time, when you're talking about like those late 2000s, Marvel was doing Marvel Adventures, and it felt like at the time, if you wanted to get into Marvel, that was the pipeline, was Marvel Adventures, because like Jeff Parker, Paul Tobin, a few other people were kind of come up through that system. And so I was like, all right, cool, I'm gonna do all ages superheroes. So I made a book called Johnny Monster, and I just kind of like would rush through it because I was like, my intent was to get it made, right? So it was like that.
It's a portfolio piece, but you're not passionate about it. Yeah.
Yes. And then I did a book called Overlook. And then I was just like, I was friends with Layman, and Layman was doing Chew. So I was like, I'm going to do a book like Chew. Like I was very much in a mimic. And this is the thing I've talked about this a lot of other things, right? I felt like I was mimicking people a lot.
Right.
And then did a couple little graphic novels, but then I got into Bendis's class. And I remember being in Bendis's class and talking to him. I would turn my scripts in here in Portland at PSU. Bendis had a comic book writing class. It was his first year. It was the very first time I ever did it. And I would talk to him about stuff. And the thing he would always say is like, it was very clear I was very ambitious. Like I was very ambitious, was very clear. And I remember I would give him my scripts and he'd give me like an A. And I'd be like, what are my notes? Like I'm so desperate to learn anything. What am I doing wrong? And he was like, the A is your note. Like I don't have anything else to say to you. But the problem was I hadn't figured out the voice for myself as a writer. But then I also, again, I was just mimicking, and I wasn't really like, I don't know, it was weird, but I knew all the right people at the same time, right? Like at that point, I knew a lot of people at Marvel. I knew people at DC. I had done this book. This was actually, no, I think this was the first fully realized book I did before Dear Dracula. I did a book called Necessary Evil.
Okay.
And it was about a school for supervillains. It was like an evil Harry Potter. And I did this book back in, I think I self-published the first issue in 2005.
Okay.
And it took a while to get it going. And originally it was going to be published through Desperado, when Desperado had a deal with Image, and then it didn't have a deal with Image. It was this whole thing. It kept getting delayed. And we only published 9 of the 10 issues. The 10 issue has never been published.
Oh man.
But we tried. It was a lesson that I learned, that like I was learning all these lessons the hard way, basically.
Right.
Like, I feel like I was always learning the lessons in the field. But at the same time, I wasn't talking to any writers. I was only talking to artists throughout this whole process, right?
And if you've got a bunch of ideas and you're organized, I know quite a few artists are just like, oh, you've already had stuff published. You know what you're doing. Yeah.
I did not know what I was doing. So with Necessary Evil, I had, before I was even Bendis' class, I took the first 2 issues of Necessary Evil, which I thought were really strong. And I sent them to Marvel and DC, like the slush piles, basically. And Dustin, who at that time was he was like drawing Batman, I think by then, he was doing Shadow of the Bat, he had drawn Detective. He would tell his editors, like, you should look at this guy's stuff. You should actually look at it,
Right.
And then one day he said to them, and this is like, goes a long way, but Dustin basically said to one of the editors at DC, he was like, either you're going to hire him first or Marvel's going to hire him first. Right. And then like a week later, Jordan White at Marvel, he'd only been at Marvel for like a few months. And it was the very first time they ever said, you can pick a writer for a short story. Go.
Nice.
And he went to the slush pile and he pulled out my books, just complete random. Because I mailed them in. He just randomly picked up the 2 copies of Necessary Evil. He read them. He really liked them. He went to the comic book store. He bought what had come out at that point. I think like 3 and 4 had come out. He bought them. He emailed me out of the blue because my email was in the comics, and he was like, "I want to do a 10-page Hulk story." And this was in 2008. It was like the end of 2008, and I was like, "Of course." And I don't think I did I didn't have the language yet to explain myself to people. I remember talking to him, and I could tell there was like a language barrier in what I thought creatively and what he did as an editor. But I did this 10-pager.
What was that published in?
So here's the thing. So I did this 10-pager for Marvel. It was a Hulk 10-pager. Jordan was like, this is really cool. At the time, Andy Granov, the guy who designed the Iron Man armor and all that stuff, he was looking for a 10-pager because of his calendar and his schedule. And he was like, I guess he was talking to them about it. And Jordan was like, well, I have this 10-pager. Do you want to read it? And he read it and he was like, I love this. I want to do this. I want to draw this. So Andy Granov started drawing this 10-pager. And at some point, somebody was like, wait, what is he doing? Stop. No, he cannot draw that 10-pager. If he's drawing anything, he should be drawing Iron Man. Like, you know what I mean? He should be drawing other stuff. Like, somebody figured out, like, no, he should not be drawing this 10-pager. Give him something else to do. And so he stopped. And then it was picked up by the artist who draws Monstrous. And she ended up actually finishing it, and then it was published in the backup of Hulk like years later. I can't remember what it was.
Crazy.
But it took years. And so I had I basically started doing a little bit of work for Marvel and work for DC, but I was kind of in that zone where it was like, oh, we need this now. Can you do this? Can you do this?
Yeah,
I started doing these
little minutes and the saving grace, this is on the schedule stuff. Yeah.
So I started doing all these little things here and there. And then I started working for Ben Abernathy. He would have me do like custom publishing stuff. Because I met Ben through Dustin years earlier. We just got along.
It's funny that you started with the custom publishing stuff, because at Marvel, I kind of had the same thing with Bill Roseman, where like
Bill Roseman's awesome.
Yeah, I did that Disney Kingdoms book, the Figment thing, but
that's right.
But I also was doing at Marvel, I was doing all these the Candy comics, right? Like all the advertising stuff, and
I was doing serial comics. There's
the pack-in books. I did over a year on Spider-Man magazine, which is a thing in the UK and Europe, and so it's like mazes and games. and then they would have a 10-page original Spider-Man story. And at the time, it was based on Spider-Man Web Warriors, the Saturday morning cartoon. So as long as a character showed up in Web Warriors, I could use it in the comic. And every friggin' Marvel character and every Spider-Man villain showed up at some point. So almost every issue I would do a team up, because I wanted to show that I could write Captain America, I could write Thor, I could write all these different villains and all this stuff. And so it was a way for me to just get paid and also kind of, prove myself bit by bit over there. Yeah.
Well, that's what I was trying to do at DC, and I felt like, I remember I had done a bunch of like one shots. I did a bunch of inventory stories, and I had done all this stuff for DC, and I was doing a mini for them based on a video game on Uncharted. And then I remember when New 52 started kicking off, and I had all these friends who were getting these calls like, we're gonna do this book, we're gonna do this book, you want to have this job, you want that job. I was like, and I think naively so, like waiting for my call, because I had done so many one shots for them and so much little stuff for them. But I wasn't ready in a lot of ways. And I had like image books coming out, I was doing stuff, and then they that call never came. And I remember like my brain kind of broke that spring. Because like all at that point I was talking to other writers, and all these other writers I knew and I was friends with, they all were getting those jobs, because I was friends with Scott Snyder and Kyle Higgins and Josh Fialkov and like Matt Costa. I knew those guys. Those are all getting these jobs. And then I went to New York Comic Con, and I was in the DC offices, and one of the editors was like, would you want to do Voodoo? Like, you want to take over Voodoo? And I was so desperate at the time just getting the building that I was like, yes, let's do it. I was just so hungry for work, you know, and so I got that job. I got that job, and I got along really, really well with editorial, but I don't think I was doing good work there. And at the same time, I was just doing what I was told, and I was just doing the same problem I was mimicking, right? And I would talk to Marvel, and I would do all these things, and I just wasn't doing any of my own work. And then I remember Bob Harris on the last day of New York Comic Con 2012, or it was the Monday after. So the Monday after New York Comic Con 2012, I was out of DC work. It was the first time in years I had nothing on the plate, like even little stuff where it's like, oh, eventually, like there was all conversations had stopped. And I remember I was in the building, and Dear Dracula, that book I had done years before, it was getting turned into a cartoon on Cartoon Network, and it was going to premiere in October. And so I was like, man, I got a cartoon, like you guys should hire me, But one of the things I started figuring out was I started always pitching myself, not projects, right? So I'd be like, you should hire me, you know me. You should hire me, you work with me before you know me.
Right.
And Bob, I remember meeting him in the stairwell and talking to him about stuff and talking about comics with him and everything. And he's walking me down the stairs in the New York building. And we get outside, and he basically walked me out of the building, and he pat me on the back, gave me like good luck kid. And I remember walking back out onto the streets in New York and being like, did I just get fired? Like, I guess.
Sorry for laughing.
Done. No, but that's what it was. I was like, I guess I'm done. And I had no work prospects. Like I had been working on Ghosted with Skybound, but it was like a long process, and I had been talking to Dark Horse about stuff, and I was like, oh man, I don't know work. And we're going home and being like, I got to figure this whole thing out. And that was one of the biggest takeaways. Like I started realizing like I hadn't been true to myself, and I was making books that I wouldn't buy. I was making books that I wouldn't care about. I've been doing that for a long.
It's such a huge thing. Like one of the things that turned for me, like when I started doing exactly like Skull Kickers was the fantasy book that I wanted to read. And so I found people who liked the same kinds of things that I did, and they were into it, right? And the kind of book that I wanted to see more of. And then people asked me to do stuff like that. And that was same thing with Wayward, same thing with like any of those early projects are really about, you setting a precedent. And if you're setting a precedent on stuff you don't believe in, or you don't feel passionate about, or you're not excited, and it sounds weird because you're producing a bunch of material. And
you think so. I had this. So I eventually I had to figure out two things, right? So the first thing I had to figure out was that part of the like, this is who I am as a writer. This is what I got to start figuring out. What would I actually make? Like, if I could do what I want, what could I actually make? And so I started, working on Ghosted more and like figuring some things about Ghosted and being like, Ghosted is the horror book I want. It's a horror crime book. That's what I want to do. That's actually my
Right.
passion is, stuff I love. Like, why am I trying to write these like weird superhero books? They're still fun, but they're not me.
Right.
Like I gotta figure this thing out. And so then I started working on all these pitches. So it was like Birthright and Nailbiter and all this stuff. And I started figuring these things out and gaining some confidence there. And I remember I got really lucky with custom publishing. That basically I was like, it was rough because I was broke, I was broke. I had no job prospects, but I'm working on pitches basically, right? And this is my only job, is this. And one day I got a call from DC, and I had done some custom publishing in the past, and they were like, General Mills wants to do more serial comics. They really liked working with you last time. Would you do it again? And I was like, yes, I would. And I was like, actually, last time there were 4 of them and I only wrote 1 of them. Is it possible to write all 4? And they were like, yes, actually, that's why we're calling you. We want you to do all 4, but you have to all do them all in 1 month. You got to do them all right now. They're all like 28 pages. And I was like, It's on. So I wrote them all, and that gave me like a little bit of it basically paid for my year, right? At the time, I was a very low budget living person, So I was like, all right, I figured it out. But so I started writing more and figuring this, and I feel like, I'm sure you're familiar with like the hero's journey and everything. And there's a part in the hero's journey, it's the belly of the whale, right?
Yeah.
Like you're in the belly of the whale and you don't know what's happening in the outside world. The outside world is what's happening to you. And that's how I felt like I was the moment Bob walked me out of the door, because I was no longer talking to DC. I wasn't talking to Marvel. I wasn't really talking to a lot of publishers. And at the time, because everyone was so busy, and I also felt like, how do I put this? This is going to sound crappy. I feel like because I wasn't necessarily doing that well in comics, people weren't returning my calls as much, right? Even people who were other writers or artists I knew, it's like, maybe they felt like I was that person that's just going to be like begging for work or whatever, but I wasn't.
I can totally empathize. When I had a little a burst of interest at DC in 2012, and then that all kind of folded up in and around a lot of the drama and the New 52 and big ships moving and crazy stuff going on. And it was like when they announced me on Birds of Prey, all of a sudden I had a bunch of new friends. And then the minute that thing crumbled, a portion of those people vanished. And I was like, I've learned something very valuable. And I don't even think some of it is intentional. Like some people are really, really shallow, and other people, it's almost this weird sense of like, I think it's like subconscious. I need to spend my social capital on people that are going to get me, and they don't even know they're doing it. Do you know what I mean? And it's really, really awkward. But at the time it felt apocalyptic to me. Like I am done in comics. And then I got Samurai Jack, and then I slowly kind of climbed back out. And then I started doing work at Marvel, and things worked out. But what it meant was, by the time I started doing Thunderbolts and Uncanny Avengers, and that kind of surge happened again, I was sort of ready for it. Like mentally, I was like, okay, a bunch of people are going to pay attention that were paying attention before. Some of them are going to be good people. Some of them are going to be bastards, but my filter's a little bit properly adjusted. Right?
So I got lucky with that stuff. And then the other lesson I had to learn, we'll get back to that because I have the exact same experience as you. Is when I got, I remember what happened was it was Ghosted finally came out. So Ghosted came out in June of 2013. And it was the first time I had a book on the shelves in like 9 months, or give or take. And Ghosted came out right at San Diego Comic-Con, and I was able to sign it and sell it and talk to other creators and talk to people, and they were like, I read it and I liked it. And I had a meeting with an editor. I'm not sure if I want to say their name, even though I don't think they were wrong in what they told me.
It's fine.
But I had an editor. I had a meeting with an editor. It was a Marvel editor. And I sat down with him. He took me to like the back of San Diego Comic-Con where the steps are, and we sat there and we're talking. And at one point he kind of was just like, what do you want? I was like, well, I want you to hire me for something. And he's like, well, I'm not going to hire you for like Spider-Man. I'm not going to hire you for like a bigger project. And we started having this conversation. He was like, you've been struggling. Like he straight out knew, because they'd known me for a long time. He was like, you're really struggling. And maybe there's a reason you're struggling. You got to figure some things out. And I remember talking to him and being like, oh man, I figured out in that moment, I was like, I am wasting his time right now because I'm not coming to him with anything. Like I'm not
Right.
even, I have no plan here. I have a meeting and no pitch. I have no story. I have nothing. I'm not coming to him saying,
You're pitching
this is what I
yourself
want to
again.
do.
Yeah,
Pitch
yeah, yeah.
myself again. And so I had to learn that. And so around that time, Dark Horse and Skybound had both offered me books, and then Boom had offered me books, and I was, and then Nailbiter had gotten picked up at Image, and so I was like really gearing up for a lot of work, and I was like, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to work at Marvel and DC. This is what I'm going to do. I did do some work at Marvel, but when I decided I was going to start pitching DC again for like a variety of reasons. People coming to me at DC being like, we want you to come back, we want you to come back, we want you to come back. And I was like, no. And but then I had to take a step back, and I had to like really evaluate a lot of stuff. And that was part of me recognizing the flaws and mistakes I had made, and like the professional and emotional maturity that I had been lacking before.
Right.
And then piecing all these things together about like, well, what do I want, and what can I offer, and you know, not just taking anything they gave to me. And that's why when I had that meeting with Dan, you know, I pitched it. So I pitched him. I had a plan, and I pitched him my story on the Flash, and he was like, no, and here's why. And he gave me his notes. He gave me his honest notes on the spot, and I was like, great, you know. But then a few months later, I came to meet with him again, and I sat down with him, no longer sweaty and red faced, and I pitched him the new version of it based on his notes. And that's when he was like, oh, I love this. Yeah, let's do it. Like, that's perfect. Let's do it. He was like, I remember he hit the table, and he was like, that's what I knew. If Dan ever, if you ever talking to Dan back in DC, if he ever like hit the table and was like, let's do it, that meant it was going to happen. And he was like, I love it, let's go. And I was like, okay, great. And it was, but I recognized by the time I got to that moment where I was writing Flash, was deep into Nailbiter, deep into Birthright, like I had figured out all these lessons. And now when I'm at DC and I'm talking about things, you know, sometimes you still kind of go, oh yeah, I forgot about that, because you get into whatever groove you're in. But it's like the DC Image, talking to their writers, doing what I'm doing. Like, I'm really thankful for like the roller coaster I had, and like the moments where it felt like it was bad. Because I'll hear stories, you know, I hear stories about other writers still doing that, where they're just like, you know, why should I hire you? Well, it's me. And it's like, what do you have to say? Like, what is the character you want to do? You know, like, do you actually have a story in mind? Do you have a thing you want to do? You know, like, and what is that thing? You know, is there an actual story? And I think that's something that I started learning a lot, was like, because I would hear these stories, or I would talk to friends, and I'm sure you had this too, where they'll start pitching you something, but they're talking about these like vague ideas, or
they're talking about plot at best.
Oh, yeah. Sometimes they're just talking about tone,
or just
like,
visuals.
Oh, it'll be like,
yeah.
Well, yeah, it'll be like this movie I saw. It'll be like, you know, this French movie I saw once. I want to be like that, and you're like, what are you talking about? Dude, tell me the story.
It?
Like,
what happens? What's the emotional core?
Yeah. What is like? I think I always tell people when they're trying to pitch me stuff, or even when they're writing a pitch, I'm like, before you do anything else, here's what I want you to do. I want you to pitch your story to your best friend. Just tell it to your best friend, because when you're talking to your best friend, you're not going to go grandiose all this stuff, right? You just kind of go, oh, this is what it is.
And this is like, why it's cool.
This is what it is, right? Like, I remember walking with Sean Makowitz at Skybound. This is back in 2013. We were already working on Ghost together, and we got along really well. And I had pitched Birthright to Vertigo, and it just was like taking a long time. And I was talking to Sean, and he was like, well, what is it? What is this book you pitched on? And because I was talking to my friend in that moment, we're like walking the floor at WonderCon. We're at the Golden Apple booth, just like looking at comic books. And I was like, oh, well, this is what it is. And I just kind of like explained it really quickly. There was it wasn't even a high concept. It was just like explaining it in the most simple terms you would explain to your friend.
Nice.
And then he was like, that sounds cool. And then when the con was over, he called me and was like, hey, Skybound wants it. Can you pull it? And I was like, yes, let's go. Let's do it. They offered me this like amazing deal. And I was like, yeah, let's go. And I learned those lessons about like when you're pitching things to people, or when you're just trying to like even write a document about it. It's like, or even sometimes in scripting. So we can get to script stuff a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the things I do now is, you know, have the panel breakdown, my dialogue breakdowns. I write full. I've tried plot many times, and it never works out for me.
Not very many people do plot forward.
You'd be surprised. Like some people, you know, Scott and James do plot on a lot of stuff. And
really?
Yeah, on a lot. Not everything. Not everything.
Sure.
Like, there's some stuff that I know they both do, but at DC, especially in the last few years, they were doing plot a lot. So like Batman was written in plot, so was Death Metal, and so was Metal. Like all those things were all plot.
Interesting.
And I like, we did No Justice was plot because it was Francis Manapul.
Right.
But my stuff, it's been full. And
Sure.
I had plot a couple times, like with Howard Porter, Riley Rossmo, because he and I are really close. Like,
right.
It's like a hybrid almost sometimes, it's much more loose, but I'm for the most part a full script guy. But one of the things I do, and I've started doing this last couple of years, I realized, like, in communicating to the artists what I want, for a long time I would explain, I just do page breaks. I'm sorry, I would do the panel break and the dialogue, very much. But what I started realizing was, like, I wasn't explaining to them the totality of that page, the intent, what the
right.
was
What's
of that
the
page.
most important stuff and why?
Yeah, what is the emotional thing? So now what I do at the top of that page is I'm like, listen, this is what this page is about.
Right.
Like, this is what we're trying to do here. This is what the goal is. This is what this page is for. Here's the emotional intent that I want to tell you. Here's the thing, whatever it is, right?
Right,
It's
right.
like, this is that, and then I get the rest, right? Because then I started recognizing, it just, I think having the artist know, like, oh, I know what this page is about, and then the breakdown, they can kind of visualize what it is as a page, and then they know, like, the important part of this page is, like, I want you to get this emotion relayed to the reader.
Right. Yeah, I'll do that a lot, especially when I'm looking for like weird page layouts or stuff. So I'll say, like, this is psychic imagery in someone's mind, so let's break all the borders and make sure it feels like a real, massive images rather than a series of stacked panels. And the minute you say that, they're going to read the page differently. They're going to feel the page differently. Yeah.
So I did that a lot. I started doing that, and it's just, like, through all this stuff, like, I'm very thankful for kind of the lessons I got to get to where I'm at with the craft and the pages and how I work, and the process I have is, for the most part, on a perfect week, and this changes depending on the week. But for the most part, what I try to do is, on Monday, I try to essentially establish what I want that issue to be on Monday, right? So I basically figure out, and a lot of times because of my outlines, like, one thing I do with my outlines, I started doing this the last couple of years. When I write the outlines, I also pitch what I want the cover to be to that issue, because I feel like the cover should kind of tell you what that issue is, right? Like, what is the number one ad for that issue?
Right.
It is a complete spoiler, right? Like, what is it that I want to relay? So, it actually is really helpful. Like, sometimes I had a meeting with Ben Abernathy, and we were talking about Deathstroke a few weeks ago, and I was like, okay, on Deathstroke Inc., we were talking about what the covers were for the first 7 issues, and I was like talking about what the covers were, and then the last pages I is able to kind of relay, like, okay, because it also makes you realize, like, if you don't know what the cover is, there might be a problem with that issue. It means you don't have something cool in that issue, like, you don't have a thing.
One of the things that drives me a little crazy is, depending on who I'm working with, sometimes I won't see the cover until solicits. I literally have no idea what the cover is.
That's rough. Yeah.
And all of a sudden the solicits come and you're like, oh, that's cool. But it's like a surprise rather than a,
I'm a little bit of a control freak. So
it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing.
No,
I am when
DC
I can be.
I ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
I'm always raising my hand and being like, wait a minute. They know I want to see everything.
Sure.
But when I'm outlining, I do the covers, and so basically by the time I get to Monday, I kind of have an idea what that issue is, and I sort of, figure out whatever the thing is of it, right? All the pieces I want, and then on Tuesday I do page breaks, and then Wednesday, usually page breaks mixed with stuff, right? It's like notes and panels and things.
Yeah, or like you come up with a really cool turn of a phrase. You're like, oh, got to make sure that's in there.
And then so
you're obviously a plotter. You're not like a pantser. Like, I talk to people, they fly by the seat of their pants. They got a vague idea and they just start scripting. That's not me either. I'm like plan guy. Yeah.
Well, I'm a bit of both, because, like, even when I do, like,
there's always stuff that changes in the moment.
Oh yeah, you figure it out. Yeah, as soon as you feel it, you're like, oh man, I'm right. Like, there's a creator-owned book I want to do in the future, and I just had the idea on a Saturday morning, and I came in here and I wrote the beginning. You're just like, I know it. When I'm outlining, I usually write the first issue at the same time, because sometimes writing the first issue, you start to figure out, like, okay, here's what I'm doing. Here's what here's the story. Here's what I'm missing. And you start visualizing it. Like with Robin, it's like Robin, I know all of the emotional beats I want to hit with Robin. I don't necessarily know the issues on him, right? So
Right.
like one thing that happened recently was I turned in issue 6 to Robin. This happened a few months ago. I turned in issue 6 to Robin. And even when I turned it in, I knew there were problems with it. And I knew the number one problem was it was the crunch issue, because 1 through 5, I'd let breathe. Like each issue had an intent, right? So like 4 is Damien and Raish hanging out on a beach, and it's a grandfather-grandson issue.
Right.
5 is him with his brothers and sisters, because it's him and the other Robins, right? And then 6 is like the beginning of the tournament, and then 7 had to be something very specific, and 8 has very specific. And because of 7 and 8, because of what they were, 6 became a crunch issue. It was like shoving as much as I could to make sure.
In there.
Yeah. And so the editors, they read it and they saw the same thing, and they were like, and I was like, well, I have a solution to this, but I'm not sure you guys are gonna like it. And they were like, what is the solution? I'm like, we break it in 2. Like, what is 7? And I had already written 7. So they were like, what is 7 becomes 8, and what was 8 becomes?
You just sort of push it.
But I was like, that's gonna mess with our trade, it's gonna mess with this, mess with that. And they were like, no, it's not. Like, go right ahead. So I took 6 and I broke it into 2, and then I was able to take all the emotional moments and I was able to stretch them out, and I was able to make it breathe, and then 6 and 7 are better issues because of it.
Right.
There were 1. But help me, figure that stuff out. Yeah, with DC stuff, like, so then on Wednesday I essentially start writing dialogue, and sometimes dialogue is sprinkled in, and I have notes of stuff I want to say. Once I have the page breaks and I have some of the panels done, I will go for a walk. And what I'll do is I will record myself talking to myself, and I'll basically just kind of like, talk out loud what I want the characters to say. Right. And sometimes I talk out like, panel breaks, scenes, and I figure things out. I basically by memory talk about what the issue is and the dialogue. Wow. And then I come home and I will transcribe it myself. And in the process of transcribing it, I will figure out like,
refining. Yeah.
This goes here. Oh, this goes here. And then it's funny because I'll hear myself talking to myself, basically, right?
Right. And it's interesting. It's funny, so that process you're doing is like, I wouldn't say I'm doing it the same way because I'm not recording myself and I'm not talking out loud. But essentially what I'm doing is almost like an internal tabletop RPG, right? Because I'm playing all the characters. Yep. And we're in this scenario and I know where we're going to go with it. And so it's like, well, how's that person going to react to that? Oh, they're going to say this. Oh, and then what are they going to do? They're going to do that. And so in some ways you and I have a similarity of process, but the way you achieve it is different. That's what's interesting to me.
So yeah, I love how everyone has all these different processes. Like I know some writers just sit down. There's one writer who I'm really good friends with, and I always joke with them that they're like the writer's writer, because their entire process is they sit down and they just word vomit all of it. Like it's just all typed up, and it is so much writing, and then they edit it down. But their entire process, it's all through typing. There's no walks.
That's the similar, but it's like this brainstorm on the page kind of thing.
Yeah, they don't do notebook work, because I do a lot of notebook work. Like I do a lot of stuff. Like I have notebooks everywhere. I gotta, like, this is my Robin notebook right here, right? So it's like everything is in here, and it's like, I literally will go down the line, and it's like you can see there's no spoilers in here, but it's like I literally just do page breaks and I do little notes, right? Nice. And then I go through and I've got
scrap files everywhere. So I'll have a digital version of that with bookmarks to a bunch of reference. I'll have scrap sheets of paper with particular stuff on it. And then I sort of throw those all together in folders where I'm like, okay, this is, some of it's digital and some of it's physical, and this is all the stuff that I need. Like when I'm writing Dungeons and Dragons stuff, I literally have the handbooks and stuff like piled up beside me, and I'm just going through books and double checking, oh, well, how does that spell work? How can we do a cool thing with it or whatever? But if it's not so codified, then it's like wiki pages, or it's old issues or trades and bookmarks everywhere and all that kind of crap.
Yeah, behind me, I don't want to turn around and show you the exact books, but I have a shelf behind me that is all, whenever I'm working on a particular, say it's a DC book,
right?
I basically go, so like when I was working on Flash, I had, I wouldn't say every Flash trade behind me, but I had a lot of Flash trades. Sure. Like the key ones I knew I would need, and they were bookmarked crazy.
They were
post-it notes, little notes in the post-it.
What I
Like
do is
this
I'll I've got the Marvel Unlimited subscription, and so
Mhm.
what I do
Yeah.
is I'll read like a mad mofo on
Yeah.
my tablet, and I'm screen capping. Oh, I'll need that for reference later. Oh, that's really important. And then
I do that exact thing.
I grab that screen cap folder and I throw them onto Photoshop and I crop the panels, or I do the thing and I label
Yeah.
them all what they're going to be, so that the artist will have it and I'll have it. So I've got costume ref and color ref and location ref
Yep.
and character ref and key moments I know are going to come back in some fashion, or they might, and so I get this just horrendously big scrap folder of stuff. And what's nice about that is then the editor and the assistant editor doesn't have to hunt for it. I don't have to hunt for it. It's all there and ready to go, and I can just keep adding to that pool.
Yeah, I do that. If I will go through, and if I'm reading, I did a reread of I have the hardcovers here, but I reread all of Invincible recently. And when I was rereading it, like I would go through and just sequences either emotional stuff, or sometimes Ryan Otley would draw something that was just amazing, and I would do screen caps of it, and just be like, cool, is cool. It was interesting rereading Invincible because I was like, I remember when Invincible first came out, I was working at a store, and I was, when I was still trying to break in like as a young dummy. And I remember getting that first trade, and there's all that information in the back. Like Robert would always do all this commentary and stuff in the back. And I would have that first trade on my desk because I was like, that book, and doing the reread of it, it really reminded me not only of like loving comics, because there's a lot of reasons I love comics, there's a lot of stuff, right, but there was something special about that book at that particular moment when it came out and where I was in that moment, and
mentally,
and like seeing, it's, I think Robert, like Jeff Johns, I actually met him when he had first started at DC. Like I was reading Flash. I hadn't read it for a while, and it was like I don't say a while. I hadn't read it for like a couple issues, and I was such a hardcore Mark Waid fan that when Jeff came on, I was like, whatever, who's this guy? And, I think 3 issues had come out when I met him, and I really liked them. I had read them all in one sitting, and then I met him. It's at San Diego Comic-Con, and nobody's there. It's like Jeff just sitting there, and I walked up to him and started talking about stuff. But the reason why I'm saying that is that like it was an interesting time, and this is how it is for every creator, I feel, at certain stages, that you're getting to watch the kind of origin for all of these creators, right? Like at that time, we were watching the origin of Bendis, who's been doing it for a while, but then all of a sudden was blowing up with powers, and also Spider-Man, and I remember Brian doing Sam and Twitch, and watching Jeff with Flash, and he had already done Stargirl on JSA, but then he was taking over Flash, and then it was like, blown
explosion,
up. But there was something about Robert in that exact moment where I feel, for me, I was working at the store, and the artists I knew and the writers I knew, that when Invincible came out, maybe it was because he was younger and because he was such an indie guy, he wasn't a Marvel or DC person. If there was something different to it, right? That I feel like I would never tell Robert any of this. But I'm
just going to put it on the internet. Don't worry.
I've hung out with him a few times. I think he knows. I was joking around with Makowitz when I was in the middle of reading Invincible, and I started talking to him about it, and I was like, do not tell Robert I said this. He was like, no, Robert shouldn't know any of this. But there was something about Invincible. It was just something, even rereading it just now, it reminded me about what I loved about creator-owned books, and really about making your own stuff. And I've been working on more creator-owned right now than I have in a long time, like secretly, and for next year and the future. And I'm like, it just kind of like reinvigorated some of that stuff.
Yeah. Do you know, it's so funny. I've got a great, Image Expo, the first time they did the Image Expo, what was it? Was that it wasn't even I can't remember what anniversary
it was in Berkeley. The very first time they did it, it was in Berkeley, and I didn't understand what it was, but they did a convention. It was a convention first.
So I was there for it.
Yeah, me too.
They did an art show that first night. So they had all those originals from Image books that were in that gallery they had set up, and everyone was sitting around drinking cocktails and wandering around saying hello. And it was this like quiet, subdued, and everyone was basically like pre-drinking before they would go out and party. And so I'm wandering around looking at all this artwork. And I remember a really funny moment where there was a piece of art from Eric Shanower, and he's done all these like riffs on these famous artists. So there's like a Jack Kirby style thing and a John Romita thing and a Rob Liefeld thing. And then there's a Little Nemo in Slumberland, like a Winsor McKay. And Robert just comes up beside me, Kirkman, and he just looks at it and he goes, okay, I know what all this shit is. What is that? And then I go, dude, that's Little Nemo in Slumberland. He goes,
yeah.
And I'm like, and that's a big deal. It's like the original, comic strip from the 1900s or whatever. And he was like, Zubby buddy. And he goes, I started reading comics with Image. I literally don't know any of this shit whatsoever. And I'm looking at Robert and he goes, if it's before Youngblood, it doesn't exist. And I'm just like, God. Holy crap, man. And he was so funny about it and just like front facing with it. And we laughed,
That's really funny.
It was great. Yeah.
Awesome. So then on Thursday, I put it all together. And then usually either Friday morning or later Thursday, like the ideal is to always finish a script.
Right. In a week.
The ideal is this. Finish a script, walk away from it for a night.
Right.
Come back to a
Friday,
fresh face.
Yeah,
and then turn it in. And then lately Fridays, like I told before, Fridays have been mostly like phone calls and emails and meetings and stuff lately. And then I can, go into it. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes I'm having like extra time on it or whatever's going. But that's the ideal week.
Sure.
It depends on the project, and you have notes, and you know how it is. Like you have notes, you have proofing to do. Yeah, like today.
Do you write your own solicits?
Yes. It depends. Sometimes I'll miss them. So like with Robin, I wrote the solicits for 1 through 5.
Right.
And then they wrote 6, 7, and 8. I wrote 6, but they wrote some of them, and then I wrote whatever.
It's interesting because it's like, it all depends on like you're saying about those ideal weeks, right? But then, if it was a normal year, you'd be traveling or you'd be doing conventions or you'd be, like all over the place. And now it's like this weird, different time, right? So
it's weird. Yeah, it depends on what's going on. Like today, since you and I are done talking, I have to do oh, that's cool. I just got a bunch of covers for a book that hasn't been announced yet. I have like, okay, cool. All right, cool. My lawyer just told me the deal I've been working on forever is finally gonna finish today.
Nice.
Yeah, I was gonna email them and be like, please tell me this is done today so I can sign it. And like, it's gonna be done today. You can sign it today. And I'm like, oh god. I actually was losing sleep over that last night. The behind the scenes stuff sometimes. It is like you're just like waiting for stuff and you have no control over it.
Yeah, particularly contract stuff. You're just like, we're all excited. Can we get legal over the
I just sign this, please?
Let's
and then the
go.
lawyer's like, oh, we have a call scheduled at the end of the week, and you're like, oh my god.
I know.
Like
the media stuff. Have you must have read Bendis Fortune and Glory?
Oh, yes.
It is the greatest, most accurate portrayal of Hollywood.
Yes. In some ways, it's my favorite.
Every comic creator, same.
Yeah.
Every comic creator, it should be like required reading. Like you need to read that in order to function in this industry.
He has talked about doing a sequel.
I would love to see that.
I want him to do. I mean,
can you imagine the stories he's had?
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, but that whole thing about like everybody, I remember talking to him about it. How everyone had a poster of the Matrix. Remember, because that's part of the book. Like every single producer in Hollywood somehow was associated with the Matrix. And you go into like I remember my very first meeting ever in Hollywood was after I read that, and I walk in the lobby and they had a picture of the Matrix, and I was like, oh my god,
right?
Like, so true.
I've done the water bottle tour. Have you heard it called that? The water bottle tour. So you do it like, so because every single one of these companies, you'll come in and they have the really nice, amazing opening area. Yes. Sometimes has an award case and usually has movie posters everywhere. And there's a really nice secretary and they'll basically go, oh, can I get you a water? And they'll get you a really classy bottle of water.
Yes.
And then you just sit there. And then you drink, and so everywhere you go, they just call it the water bottle tour because you just show up and you're in the lobby and they're like, oh, let me get you a water. And then they'll take you up to see so-and-so. It's surreal when you're doing it back to back to back.
Oh yeah. One year, my agent at the time, and this is really weird. Again, this is me like not ready for the experience.
Sure.
But I had a lot of ideas and they were like, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna send you on these meetings, all of these producers and all these assistants, all these people, and you're just gonna pitch them ideas and talk about stuff.
Melt your brain, yeah.
Oh, and so basically the way it was is I went to LA for a week, and every day I basically had multiple meetings. So what it would work is I almost had like 5 meetings a day.
Oh,
Basically, what it would work is you go to a meeting for an hour, you drive for an hour. You go to a meeting, you drive.
Oh yeah,
for an
because it's
hour.
LA. Yeah.
Yeah. So I did that. I did that for 5 days straight. And then the next week I went to San Diego Comic-Con. So basically in LA for 2 weeks. And it was just like, and it sucked because it was right after I just moved to Portland. Like I had been living in California, and then I moved to Portland, and then all of a sudden that summer, because I felt like I was doing enough books and I had so many ideas, and they were just like, let's do this then. And
right.
I looking back then, I'm like, what was even the point of that? Because I was basically pitching all these ideas, and I think the point was for me to then like write those ideas, but nobody would ever like explain that to me. Like I was so young, I did not know what was going on.
Well, and that was really, the agent that I've worked with for entertainment stuff, it was really interesting having that first kind of main meeting with them where he's like, what is your end goal? Like, do you want to be a screenplay writer? And I'm like, no. And he's like, oh. I'm like, yeah, I don't want to write movies. That's not really my end goal. That's not why I'm here. You know what I mean? I said, if anything, like my version of this is I'm going to keep making comics and make them the way I want. And if someone wants to make media out of that, that's great. Like I'll Mark Miller this, like, that's, and I know and I know that's lofty or whatever, but fine. Like that's the thing. I want to be the creative person making stuff in the format I like, in the way I like, doing that with the freedom to do it that way. And then if other people want to do stuff with it, that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone back and forth on that part of it. Like, do I want to write that stuff? I mean, I feel like all of my passion is in comics, and there's other things I've talked to people about doing, particularly when it comes to like animation. Like I've had meetings about animation stuff. We've talked about it, but yeah, I don't know. It's because obviously you and I both are the same way. We have a lot of friends who are like going in that direction, or they're already in that direction.
And I don't think it's an impossibility by any means, but it's not something I'm like rushing headlong toward.
But I know where I know how I operate, and the way I operate is I have to be obsessed with it.
Right.
And if I'm not obsessed with it, you're not going to get my full work. Right. And I'm like obsessed with it. I have to feel it. Like I have that speaking of Robert, there's something Robert said. This is a weird segue, but Robert one time, he had this thing he said where every time he writes a comic, it either takes him 3 days or 3 weeks. And I feel that a lot. Like that is how it is. Like I was saying, that pattern I was telling you, where it's like, if I could easily write a comic in 3 days, right? Like I can, if I know what it is.
If you've got it clear in your head. Yeah.
If this is a get back into craft stuff. I feel like when I talk to people about their books, especially their issue ones, the number one thing I ask them is, and I this has kind of changed over the years, but really it's always the one question: what is your last page? Because I think your last page is many things. It needs to be a statement on what your book is, has to be an ad for the next issue. You got to say something new or different. And I feel this way about a lot of stuff. You have to give new information on the last page, and new information can mean things, right? But you have to give me something on the last page that's going to make me want to read
a reason to come back. Yeah.
And so whenever I talk to people and they're like, I don't know yet, I'm like, then you've got it yet. It's like you gotta. It doesn't have to always be a shock twist or anything.
Sure.
Like, what are you trying to say?
It just has to be something more, something engaging.
Yeah. I reread Saga #1 the other day, and I noticed something in the last page I had never noticed before. Well, what's interesting about that book is that the ending is like a sweet, what I originally thought is this like sweet ending, right? It's this nice ending of them as a family. It's kind of a statement on the book, right? Like Hazel has this speech going across it, and the ending, she has this thing. I remember reading the first time being like, I think Brian K. Vaughan is like an expert on issue ones.
Right.
And when I got to that ending, I was like, that's a really great statement. And I had never reread issue 1 since then. And then I reread it the other night. And in the build-up to that last moment, they talk about how in the woods there are monsters that have red eyes. I never realized that when you get to that last page, it's this nice moment of the family, and it's them holding the baby and they're kissing. In the background, there's a bunch of red eyes. I like never put that together until I read it. And I'm like, oh, it's this beautiful moment, but there's like danger behind.
Right.
It is a statement on the book. It's this family moment, and there's danger behind. It's such a great ending. I remember one time I was at a party, one of the image parties at San Diego, and I started talking to Brian K. Vaughan about endings and issue ones, and we started talking about Why the Last Man, and I was like, I really find Why the Last Man fascinating because the ending to that issue, that first issue, like the twist on that book is the title of the book. We all knew what that book was about going in.
Right.
Like, it's about all the men die.
Mhm.
So the last page is not really about that, even though all the men are dead by the last page. The cliffhanger to that book is not all the men are dead, and it isn't even what happened to the men, because you knew that going into it. You knew all those questions. You knew all that stuff. When you read issue 1, the real cliffhanger is, what was Beth going to say?
Right.
Like, when Yorick is about to propose and she's trying to talk to him and they get disconnected, that is the cliffhanger. Like, you're so emotionally involved in their relationship and those characters that even on that last page where people are like freaking out and all this stuff, and then Yorick's the last one left, it's like, and they get disconnected. And I was talking to Brian about it, and I'm like, this is my theory on the first issue. And I saw the stuff to him, and he was like, yes, that is exactly right. And I was like, yes, win. With that,
nice.
I think, so again, when I talk to people, I ask, what's your last page? Like, what is that thing that you want to do? And you have to explain to me whatever, you have to go into this whole thing. So like with Nailbiter, in my pitch about what Nailbiter is about, right? It's a town where serial killers are born there, and you're trying to figure out what happened there, and this guy went missing. And but what I haven't told you is that the worst serial killer of them all is actually still living there and is free. And we established in the beginning that he's this awful person, and he obviously should be in prison.
Right.
But then on the last page, it's this twist on everything you think you know. Like, I've given you information, all this stuff, and then, Warren is just living in the town. Like, the worst serial killer of all of them is just free and living there. You're like, what happened? It's like, so whenever I'm writing a book or figuring stuff out, that's part of why I ask, because that's what I'm trying to figure out. And again, it doesn't have to be this like crazy twist, because now twists in comics can be really difficult, and
they can be frustrating in a sense, because they feel like they don't. A great twist is something that in the moment it happens, you're both shocked and like, I don't want it to go any other way.
The best the best twist ever is Thunderbolts, right? That's like the one that they kept secret somehow and they were able to figure it out. One of the things when we talk about these conversations at DC Comics, I learned this lesson is sometimes what will happen is I'll read their issue, I'll get to their last page, and it's like a character just showing up.
Right.
And I'm like, here's the challenge with that, is that I've already seen, and it's different because I'm a different zone, but I'm like, I've seen your next 3 covers.
Right.
That character on the last page
is
they're
not
on
an
all those
exciting
covers.
reveal. Yeah.
Or sometimes they're on the cover.
Right.
So it's not a reveal. And that's why I started piecing together. And the advice I started giving people at DC when we talked about this was, it doesn't matter who the character is, it matters what they're doing.
Right. Why
so
they're
it's
there.
Like why they're there and what they're doing when they show up on the last page. Right. That's the stuff that
something gripping, something unexpected, something terrifying. Yeah.
And I so again, that's when we talk about the stuff on movies, like, what is your last page? Or do you have an ending in mind? Do you know what the end of the story is? Like, what is that thing? Like with Birthright, from the very beginning about Birthright, and I, this, it is funny, like, talking to people back then, one of the advice you would hear was, don't pitch your 50 issue epic story, right? And but that's what I pitched, and
sure.
And then it got approved, and then it went all the way to issue 50. I always knew what the last page was. Like, things fluctuated, and there's pieces of that last page that changed, but I always knew what I wanted to land on.
I was like that with Wayward. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you just knew, like with Birthright, it's about this little boy who basically loses his family in a lot of ways, right? And there's a lot of stuff in that about, Birthright is about divorce, it's about your life changing, it's about all these like very real emotional things with this fantasy setting. But what I wanted to make sure was that even though in issue 1, Mikey, the main character, he loses his family, and a lot of his motivation is about getting his family back, right? And and then recognizing that you can't always get certain things back the way they were, and but I wanted to make sure that the ending, he found his family, but in a different way. It was like this understanding of finding the new family, and then building something new, and that was always the intent of it. So I always knew that was my North Star or whatever. I knew the true north, right?
And it's so important to have that through line, because when you're meandering, or when you feel like you're losing focus, you're like, wait, where are we going, and how can we ensure that those steps are being placed there without telegraphing it so hard that the audience is like, well, of course,
It's such an interesting balancing act. But I realize I should let you go. You've actually been doing this for a while.
No, it's good, man. I'm really thrilled
yeah.
we were able to dig in as deep as we did, and it's been
fun. Me too. Yeah, it was good.
It's been good, man, and I'm really excited for people to see. I think, a lot of people, they don't want to talk about their setbacks, or they're afraid of talking about their mistakes because there's this sense of, well, I'm not a professional. And it's like, what, we've all muddled our way through. And so much of comics is do-it-yourself isms. Do you know what I mean? Where you are figuring it out. No matter how much you read, no matter how much you hear, you have to do some of it and take some lumps and go, oh, of course. Or even, I know you said that, but until it happened to me, it wasn't real, kind of thing, And so I feel like that hearing that stuff is valuable. It's not a bad thing. Yeah.
I think with that stuff, I mean, the thing that I'm thankful for now is I never really talked about that stuff online as it was happening, or in I didn't really talk about it.
But no one really does, because how can
well, they do. They do.
Oh, they do, but over a beer, not on.
Yeah. I think I talk about that stuff more now. Like, I'll always talk about, if anybody asks me, I can talk about those things because I feel like I have the distance from it in some way, where I can understand like why certain things didn't work out a certain way. And I think it's important to reflect on those things. At least for myself, it was important to reflect on those things. Like with some of the DC stuff at the time, we were talking about some of those editors, where it was like, it's, and I hear this sometimes from creators now, established creators and new creators, where they're just like, me, and that should be reason enough to hire me.
Right.
Like, no, like at the end of the day, what is the story you want to tell?
Right.
And I think that is so important. Like, you and I were talking about a little bit before we started recording about Tom Brevoort, and creators going to him, and it's like, if you're passionate, you have a plan, a story to tell, that will go longer than, because
it doesn't mean you get everything you want, but at least if you can show that you can carry an idea through, then it's also something where they can go, oh, we can take some of that energy and redirect it over here in a project that we need, and you're like, oh, okay, find the right spot, the right fit. Yeah.
And I think you can, it shows that you're thinking about these things. You're actually thinking about the story, thinking about, because I think you've seen this sometimes, is sometimes creators get very caught up in the politics of comics. And I mean that as just like an industry way,
and a social structure and everything else, and some would-be creators, I think, and I'm not trying to downplay anyone's hard work or whatever, but some of them want to autograph comics. They don't want to make comics. Like
for sure.
They just want to have be lauded as someone that did some stuff. And you're like, but you actually have to do things. Like, you have to finish things.
I learned a lot of those kinds of lessons. I was never really interested in the fame part of it, or signing. I never felt necessarily that comfortable with a lot of that stuff. So it's so weird to me. But it was weird. It's like, I just wanted to make comics. I guess this is what from the very beginning, like, to bring it all back around. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with making comics. Right. I wanted to make comics. As an adult, I wanted to tell stories, and that was the lesson I had to learn. Right. For the whole
but in this medium,
in this medium, exactly. I want to tell stories in this medium, and I want to tell the right.
Awesome.
That's to bring it all back around.
It's great, man. I really appreciate it. It's awesome. I think people are really going to enjoy it too.
Yeah, I hope so. Right on.
Awesome.